Joining us today is Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, a professor of intelligence and security studies at Coastal Carolina University, where he also serves as a director of the Intelligence Operations Command Center. Dr. Fitsanakis is also one of the moderators of IntelNews.org, a specialist website which provides news and analysis of espionage, intelligence and security issues, and is a great expert and found the time to talk to us. Doctor, thank you for your time and for your presence. Great to have you on our program.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Doctor, the New York Times piece just stormed the online services. I mean, I think that almost every intelligence world newsletter published it as a top news, a kind of a breaking news. But it's no secret for anyone who is close to those issues that U.S. intelligence agencies just had to be present in Ukraine. So what do you make of the information that were revealed by New York Times? What do you make of the timing of revealing those information? What is your assessment of the facts that were described by New York Times?
I think everything about this article is important. It includes the timing of its release, but also, of course, the content. To understand the significance of the article, we have to go back to 2014, the time when the invasion of Crimea took place by the Russians. And at that time, the Ukrainian intelligence establishment, such as it was, can be described as practically useless. It was riddled with Russian sympathizers. It was kind of bloated, sort of like a Soviet-style bureaucracy, and the sluggishness and lack of capabilities was notorious. But it was at that time when the Ukrainians realized the significance of intelligence if they were going to be able to remain standing in the clash against the Russians. And it was then, about 2014, 2015, as the article actually states, that the Ukrainians reached out to the United States and proposed some kind of an alliance of operations. In fact, that alliance, and that is sort of the part of the article that's kind of interesting, was so significant that today we can practically say that the reason why the Ukrainians remain standing in this war against Russia is primarily the intelligence aspect of this war. But at the same time, the Ukrainian significance, the Ukrainian collection of intelligence against the Russians is so significant for the United States that we can classify the Ukrainian intelligence agencies as one of the most important American allies in the intelligence aspect of their relationship with Russia. So it is definitely a kind of a two-sided approach to this problem.
Okay, the thing that you just mentioned is very interesting from the standpoint of someone who lives in Central Europe and from, as me, as a citizen of a state that I think knows a thing or two about the way that Russia operates in this part of the world. And it's obvious that Ukraine, with its experience, has also a huge amount of information about Russia. What is the nature of or actually what is the value of the information that Ukraine can gather about Russia, as we are talking about the state that was in a kind of Russia, was in a kind of long-standing negotiation process. We remember meetings of NATO-Russia Council during the NATO summits. We remember the long years of reset policies. And on the other hand, and we know this from the discussions with the representatives of American intelligence community, in this community there was no doubt that Russia is still ruled by a KGB officer, and it means that Russia is still the same or almost the same state as it was before 1989. So what does American intelligence community make of those 10 years of war on two stages of the Russian invasion against Ukraine?
I'm glad you mentioned the reset era. You know, American intelligence went through a period of sort of disregarding Russia in the 1990s. There was a time when many American Russia experts or Soviet experts retired, moved on to other things, because in those days, Russia and Russian intelligence was not particularly of interest to the United States. That was something that is now being regretted, right? So there was a gap in understanding of Russian intelligence, especially the transition between Soviet times and the Putin era. And so when the war began, and I'm referring here to 2014, not 2022, America found itself unable to collect enough information inside Russia. There's a lack of Russian language experts and language culture, Russian culture experts inside the United States intelligence community. There's a lack of forward operating bases near Russian territory. It's very difficult for Americans to collect intelligence inside Russia. It's referred to often as a denied area for American intelligence. So the best the Americans could do historically is to recruit Russian officials outside of Russia. The Ukrainians are offering a change in the way the game is played. Ukrainians look Russian, they sound Russian often if they want to, and they understand Russian thinking and culture a lot more than any other Western Europeans that you can think of. And so the alliance here was one of, America is going to assist Ukrainian intelligence agencies with operations, and by that I mean intelligence collection methods, but also espionage. And the Ukrainians are going to assist the Americans with having sort of inroads inside Russian thinking and also sabotage Russian operations. So the alliance between America and Russia has taken place in a kind of a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, Americans are assisting the Ukrainian intelligence agencies sort of create secure and safe from Russian influence areas of operation, right? So I'm going to remind you again that I said earlier that up until 2014, you couldn't really rely on Ukrainian intelligence agencies to be free of Russian control and Russian influence. So the Americans kind of built specific units inside existing Ukrainian intelligence agencies with polygraph officers who are able to, vouch for sort of their independence from Russia. And then at the same time, they train them in both intelligence operations such as, assassinations, killings, etc. Some of them have taken place actually inside Russia in the recent years, but they've also trained them in collection. And so how to operate inside Russia, how to operate inside parts of the world, not just Russia, but also Europe, Latin America, even places like Cuba, etc., where the Russians are actually active. So what you have here is sort of this, the CIA is showing Ukraine how to do the sort of the practical side of intelligence. And the Ukrainians are giving the CIA the ability to look deep inside Russian thinking and Russian operations.
Doctor, I'm not sure if all our viewers understand the significance of, in terms of the history of the relations, the intelligence rivalry between United States and Soviet Union and then Russia from the standpoint of the thing that you just mentioned. Even if we look at the history of internal intelligence community debates inside United States, there are tons of books written about the story and the debates that were that just took place inside the CIA. We've heard the issues regarding Joseph Angleton and his history, his viewpoint on Russia, the questions of influence that Russia and KGB was trying to put on CIA, on American intelligence community. And I think it's fair to say that despite winning the Cold War, United States and the NATO won Second World War, we cannot call this 50, 60 years of intelligence war a full success from the perspective of US. We haven't heard about successful operations of Western intelligence agencies on the territory of Soviet Union. And even if we look at the Wikipedia text about the recent fires in distant plants and industrial complexes inside Russia, and there are tons of them, and there are unexplainable, we are thinking about the breakthrough. If that's, at least part of it, is a part of intelligence work, we didn't see any kind of this successes in the history of relations between US and Russia. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with you 100%. Even though the Cold War was won by the United States quite resoundingly, we can't say the same exact thing about the intelligence side of the war. The Russians often scored successes in the intelligence aspect of this Cold War clash that remain impressive to this day. And the reason for it is because the United States primarily focused on technological collection, right? So we have agencies like the National Security Agency, which is the largest US intelligence agency by far, and one of the largest in the world, if not the largest in the world, that concentrated on finding information about the Russians without going there, essentially, because it was so difficult to actually spy on the ground inside Russia, and even the Russian satellite countries that were very tightly controlled by authoritarian governments. Now that, of course, can give you a number of successes, and the NSA had a number of those during the Cold War. But the problem with having a lack of human intelligence operatives inside your adversary's sort of territory is that you can see what they're doing, but you can't understand the why, the motivation. What exactly are they thinking? So when Putin took over Russia, the Kremlin, he designed a system of government that was so centralized, but decision-making is so centralized that you're going to have someone very close inside Putin's inner circle to understand what he's thinking. The satellite photos and the intercepts of wiretaps and things like that are not sufficient. And so that's the problem the Americans have had ever since Putin took over power in the Kremlin. And the Ukrainians are offering the ability to operate deep inside Russian territory for two reasons. As I mentioned before, they can play that part very well. Physically, they can do that, but also they're willing to do it. Not everybody's willing to do that. This is very dangerous kind of stuff to operate deep inside adversarial territory. Some of these cases you've mentioned of fires and explosions and even assassinations, you cannot conduct those unless you have very active, very well-trained, quite extensive cells of operatives deep inside Russia. And again, historically, American intelligence has had a problem being able to fulfill that mission or that role. The Ukrainians appear to have no problem with that. They did need some training, quite a bit of training, actually. The CIA kind of fulfilled that role. But at this point, the intelligence war inside Russia is very developed. And I would say it's a major aspect of the war that typically media reports do not give it enough attention. That's why that article that you mentioned is so important.
There is also a counterintelligence aspect of the process that we are talking about, and I assume that the reason for which the polygraphs were in use, and this is the reason why we have this kind of information, because historically another problem with post-communism as a system, and we've read it and we struggled. We had problems inside Central Europe, inside Poland, as well with the, if we can call it a heritage or a bad history of the people who were part of the Soviet intelligence community. The infamous story of Mr. Sims, who was himself a part of the communist regime apparatus, and then he was working for Russia, FSB, KGB, when the Baltic states joined the NATO is just one example, but there are tons of these examples. So what is the level of risk assessment? Because it's kind of joining the whole intelligence apparatus of a former Soviet Union republic, which Ukraine was, with all the history, with all the knowledge, with understanding of Russia, but on the other hand, also with infiltration of the Ukrainian services by KGB, FSB, whatever you call it. This poses risk for US intelligence, a risk of infiltration. How do you handle this kind of things?
Well, you've noticed, of course, there is a sort of the other side of this coin, which is that since the invasion of Ukraine began in 2014, but more recently, since 2022, we've had a wave of expulsions of Russian, quote-unquote, diplomats from European capitals throughout the continent. So there's a reason for it. The reason for it is that these expulsions were sort of preemptive. to try to limit the ability of Russian intelligence officers to be in contact with European officials, both in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. So they cannot recruit, essentially. Now, that has been sort of an interesting approach to the problem. The Russians are responding to this by using so-called illegal operatives, illegal spies. These are people who are operating on behalf of Russian intelligence, both military and civilian, but are not connected directly with Russian intelligence, Russian foreign service agencies, but also not even with Russia in some cases, right? So we have this sort of interesting approach to the problem of intelligence recruitment. I would venture to speculate that Russian intelligence recruitment abilities have been very much hampered, at least in Europe, not so much in Latin America, not so much in Africa, not so much in Asia, but definitely in Europe, where the core of this clash is actually happening. You've seen a sort of a very active counterintelligence posture by the United States and its allies. And this is significant actually for other former kind of Soviet bloc countries, including Poland. The kind of the thinking right now in NATO circles is that Ukraine is kind of step number one, right? So if that succeeds, you're going to have an expansion of Russian military influence across the continent. And the model that the Americans have followed in Ukraine could serve, in fact, probably is serving right now as sort of an example of how this should be done in places like Poland, in places like Romania, in places like, Georgia, and so on and so forth, to fend against a possible Russian expansion of its influence in that part of the world.
Yeah, the U.S. intelligence was informed about the plans of Russia, and no one believed, basically, or there were certain states that didn't believe U.S. intelligence. We know that now. We know because it was revealed by the political figures of United States and of Western countries that Poland, among other states, was warned about the upcoming Russian full-scale invasion. And that brings me to the question of the way we understand the first phase of the full-scale invasion. It was a total disaster from the perspective of former Soviet Union, Russia ruled by Vladimir Putin. We now can try to assess the level of preparedness of Ukraine with certain types of weapons being used, with the javelins being a rock stars of the social media war, with the specific units fighting this war in certain way, with managing to contain the Russian aggression on a vast territory of Ukraine. What was the meaning and what was the level of this intelligence gathering that took place since 2014 to be prepared for what came on the 24th February 2022? What's your assessment?
Well, it's actually interesting that when the invasion began in 2022, the most recent phase of the invasion, even though the United States removed all of its officials from embassies and consulates throughout the country, the CIA station inside Ukraine did not leave. That is not something that happens on a regular basis. I mean, you have dozens, probably even more than 100 operatives, American operatives, that remained on the ground in Ukraine throughout the first phase of the war. And I think that the intelligence, not just collection, as you mentioned, but also training, particularly of special forces inside Ukraine, we can credit that, at least I personally would credit that, with Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. I mean, I will remind you of the significant battle at the Hostomel airport in the first couple of days of the war that most military tacticians credit as the reason why the Russians were unable to basically have a foothold inside the centers of power of Ukraine in Kiev, and actually take out the leadership of the country, which is what they were hoping to do. That was part of their plan. In fact, that was the major part of their plan, to behead, quote unquote, That's what they called it, the Ukrainian leadership. And that ability to connect with the airport and create it as a base to bring in more troops was the reason why they couldn't do it. And that's why Ukraine remained standing. So even in that aspect, the tactical aspect of the initial phases of the conflict, the ability of the CIA and the Ukrainian forces or intelligence agencies to collect, but also to train them in guerrilla warfare, in fighting against Russian troops, you can be credited that with the current phase of the war.
That's very interesting, but I don't want, of course, to get too deep into the details. Actually, we are not only at the real war on the territory of Ukraine, but the info war and information gathering occurs all the time. But I'm always very interested in the extent to which this kind of training may be referred also to the information that we've heard about the activities of Ukrainian armed forces behind enemy lines inside the territory of Russia. And I'm not speaking here about the activities in the Crimea, which, as we know, belongs to Ukraine as Luhansk and Donetsk, but the things that were happening in Belgorod, for example, the raids inside the territory of Russia, the killings that you mentioned, and our guest and friend Chuck Farrer always, since the first days of this war on our program, referred to those activities as not only activities of the guerrillas being behind the enemy lines, but as an activity of the, whatever you call it, the secret services, the special forces, the people who act as regular citizens, but in fact are part of a bigger process, which is orchestrated by the secret services.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, this is not a bunch of guys that decide one day to just kind of cross into Russian territory and see what can happen. They are definitely professionals. They've been trained. This is not something Ukraine could have done, by the way, before 2015. This is definitely sort of, you can see the sort of the elements of training there by a Western intelligence agency, and most likely the Central Intelligence Agency and others as well. The CIA, according to the article you referred to at the beginning of our conversation, has built something around, and maintains today, something around a dozen bases very close to Russian territory. Some of those bases are actually in Russian-occupied territory inside Ukraine. So you can see a direct line of operational thinking between that architecture, the sort of a dozen bases or so close to the Russian border, and some of the incursions that you refer to. These are sort of guerrilla-style attacks, but they're not conducted by amateurs or by kind of citizen militias. These are conducted by trained intelligence operatives with tactical experience in intelligence operations, no question about it.
Okay, my final two questions, because whenever we speak about it, based on the article that we are referring to, anyone who knows the history of the last years of the Cold War must refer to Afghanistan. And what we know by now, because it was revealed in the past, that CIA was active in Afghanistan and actually created a movement that actually kicked out Russians out of Afghanistan in late 1980s. And at least from some perspective, it looks similar to me. Well, we do not have Stingers now, but we have Javelins. We do not have Mujahedeens right now in Ukraine, but we do have people who are fighting this war, apparently with the support of Central Intelligence Agency. Does it look like a kind of applying the knowledge that was gathered not so long time ago in new circumstances?
Well, it's not hard to miss the parallels, but I would say there are two important parallels that we have to point out. One of them is, first of all, the patience that it takes for the long war. Afghanistan was a 10-year process. In fact, you can even argue that the CIA was sort of active there even before the Russian invasion quite dramatically. And so you're looking at 15 to 18 years of activities that must remain stable and constant. And the second parallel that I want to point out is the willingness of a local people to keep fighting for the long war. Westerners and Americans in particular are notorious for their lack of patience. They want quick results, they want sort of immediate victories, and this is not how this war, or in fact the Afghan war that you referred to, played out. This is going to take a while, and Putin and his followers in the Kremlin are willing to wait for the long war. So whether that success that we saw in Afghanistan can be repeated in Ukraine will depend largely on America's decision or, continuous understanding of the importance of the war and not losing its kind of patience, but also the willingness of the Ukrainian people to keep suffering the consequences of a very brutal, very bloody, and actually very unpredictable war. Even though I mentioned that the intelligence kind of side of the war is actually working out quite well, this war is far from over, and anything can happen, including a resounding Russian victory. This is still very much on the cards.
At least according to the Russian planners, they are counting on a long war, and they refer to their history of ones that they fought on their territory, because they assume Ukraine is their territory. And many of those wars, or actually almost all of them, were won when the war was fought on the territory of at least this part of European spheres and European fractions of Russia, Soviet Union. My final question, and I know it's very hard to answer this kind of questions, but it's not that this kind of information just drop out of the files of papers of CIA officer who was just going by the subway to his office in New York. Usually there are decisions to leak this kind of information. We of course do not know that for sure, but at least we should assume. So why now? Is anything happening right now in the world that could trigger the one who holds the or secures the secrets of that kind to leak it to the media?
Well, I think the Ukrainians, just like pretty much everyone else around the world, are kind of anticipating American developments in the domestic political scene between now and next November. So the concern here is a dramatic change in policy by Washington. Not so much necessarily just on the presidential kind of scale of things, but also in terms of congressional decision-making and potentially even changes inside the leadership of the intelligence community in the United States, but also in the defense establishment. So I think there's an effort, a considered effort, to win hearts and minds inside America, but also by extension inside Western Europe. That is not an easy task. As I mentioned before, there is a kind of a lack of patience on the Western European and American side, but also there's a sort of cracks appearing in the resolve and the commitment of Westerners to contain Russia in Ukraine. So I think the timing of the article is at least as important as the contents of the article. Both are part of this intelligence war that's taking place right now on a global scale.
Yeah, definitely we can talk about at least a partial success of CIA in that regard. That's obvious. But I remember back in 2013 and 2014, I think it was the last book of Tom Clancy, when Tom Clancy was still alive, was exactly the book about this kind of activity of Central Intelligence Agency in Ukraine, with the scenarios that now seem to be, as in many books of Tom Clancy, just referring to the real activities of the real intelligence services. The book is very interesting. There were some other books by Tom Clancy after he passed away, but by different authors. I think that this one was the last one that was written by him. Doctor, thank you very much for your time, for your insight, and for your help in understanding this groundbreaking article. Hope we're going to have a chance to talk again soon.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you can leave us your email here on rachoń.com. That's our Substack. And if you leave us your email, we'll try to get back with the reports from the front lines of the ongoing war against the West that we try to follow on our program. Stay safe. See you tomorrow. Ciao, ciao.